Hello and welcome to the first video about Django and Django REST framework development on my YouTube channel. And the first thing that I would like to talk about in this cycle is how we could use email addresses instead of usernames in Django. So while it's not so trivial task, if you are familiar with Django authentication system, you know that it makes use of usernames instead of email addresses. However, when it comes to development of business application, it is crucial to use email addresses or other fields such as phone numbers as login credentials because it's more common for your users and your users would have more pleasant user experience. Well, how we could use it? Well, there are two extremes that you could find everywhere in the web. The first thing first is to just save email addresses in username field, which is not what you should do, because in this way you will not have a lot of validation options. Actually, you will not have any validation options. You could not guarantee that this email address is actually an email address. And another extreme that is also not appropriate for Django developers is to use third-party libraries, because in this case you will not guarantee that all lines of code that you have in this third-party library are actually secure. You don't know what this library actually does, and for such small functionality, bringing potentially security leak is not a wise policy. So what we will do in this video, we will see how we could implement this task using just Django and Django REST framework. So we will not use any third-party library. So let's see how we could do it. As you could see on my screen, I have already created small Django project skeleton, and let's start with the model definition, the first step of Django application development. So let me just go to my terminal and let me run a command that's called poetry run Python manage.py start app users. So in this project I make use of poetry in order to manage dependency and virtual environments. So let's go back to the Visual Studio Code, and you see we have this users app created. So the first thing that I like always to do is to remove this test.py, because I prefer to have tests in a separate folder. So I will have tests for different layers such as views, serializers, forms, etc., etc. And let's start with the model definition. So the first thing first, we need to import several things from Django contrib auth package. So from Django contrib auth models, we need to import abstract base user, we need to import permission mixin and a base user manager. So we also need to import UID function, because I like to use UIDs as unique identifiers of primary keys for my models. So let's create a user model. The first thing first, we need to extend abstract base user and a permission mixin class. So the first value that we need, the first field, sorry, that we have here is called primary key, and I call it ID here, and we say models UID because it's a type of UID. It is a primary key. We set its value to true. The default value would be this UID function from Python, and we should not make it editable, so we will not allow to admins to modify it from the admin dashboard. And the next field that I always like to have in my models called created at, and it's not something requirement, but just I like to have this field to save information when this model was created. And now let's see what we actually need to do here. We need to provide an email, and email would be a type of email field. So why we use this email field? Well, in this way we could use this model validation, field validation, and we could ensure that the value that was supplied by user is actually in email. Well, we could not guarantee that this email does exist. For this you need to do what is called email confirmation. However, in terms of email format, we will see that this field allows us to check that this value is not just some kind of arbitrary string, but just a properly formatted email. And we need to set a unique to true, because we'll use this as a username field. And the final thing here is called stuff, and the stuff is a boolean field, and default is to false. Because this particular field is stuff is used by Django authentication system to validate if this user has an access to admin dashboard. We need to say here username field, so we need to specify it, and we call it email. and we also need to specify user manager, but first thing first, we need to create it. So let's create a custom user manager. So say user manager, and it extends base user manager. So here we need to override two functions. The first called create user, which is used to create users. So we have here self, we have here email, we have password, and we have any extra fields that we may need. So the first thing first, we need to check that email was supplied. So if not email, we will raise a value error. So the next thing, we need to create actually a user model. So we use here self.model, and we use this normalize function that is supplied as a part of base user manager class, and it allows us to normalize email address. So and next, you need to remember that this user was created, and if we need to update it, we need to commit these changes. So we use user set password function in order to securely store password. So never store a password as a plain data. So here we say user.save, and we return a user. So another function that we need to override is called def create super user, and it is used to create super users. Well, we will not use it in our API, however, it's still very important to have it. So we have here self, we have here email, and we have here password. So the first thing first, we need to create a new user. Say self create user, and we provide here email, which is an email, and we have here a password. And now we say user is super user to true, and we say user is staff also to true. And finally, we will save this, we will commit these changes, and we need to return this user. So this is how we implement a user manager. The last thing we need to have here, an object, and we say here a user manager. So now we have this models created, and we could now start with implementing this REST API logic. So let's see how we could do it using Django REST framework. Okay, so once models are implemented, actually one model is implemented, we could start creating an API views. And first thing first, when it comes to Django REST framework, is actually to create what is called serializer, and then to have an API view. So inside this users app, we will create a new file that is called serializers.py, and here we will do several imports. So first thing first, from Django contrib auth package, we will import this get a user model function that allows us to have a user model that is active in our application. And from REST framework, we will import serializers. So the first thing first, we will obtain a user model, and then we will implement a SignupSerializer. So serializer that is used for SignupAPIView. So we call it SignupSerializer, and it will be actually a model serializer. And for model serializer, the first thing, we need to create a meta class. So here we will provide a model, which will be user. We will provide here also a list of fields. So we have here email, we have password, and we have ID. And we will provide several extra quirks. So we will not want to make our password visible in the response, and we will not want to have an ID as a required field as a sign-up, because in this stage we don't have any ID, which will be generated by a backend. So the next thing, we need to override a method called create. So why we need to actually override it? Because by default, when it comes to model serializer, it will make use of create methods provided by object manager. However, if we will recall a models.py file, you remember that our user manager actually has a method called create user, and this method allows us to have a custom save logic, and especially here we will have what is called a set password. Because when it comes to the create methods, a create method does not actually store password in a hashed form. So in this way, the first thing we need to do, we need to have here actually this create user method called. So we say here user object, and then we call create user. We specify here email, which will be a validated data email, and we also have here a password that also comes from validated data. And now we could just return this user, and this is actually all what we need to have here. So now let's go to the views.py, and let's here import from REST framework generics. We will import create API view that will used as a foundation class, and we also want to import permissions, and in this case we will need to allow any, because for sign up endpoint we don't have any user that is already created. So the purpose of this endpoint actually to create users, so we need to allow to unauthorized users to access this endpoint. And finally, from users.serializers file we need to import SignupSerializer. So now we will create this SignupAPIView, and we will extend create API view, and all what we need to do here is to specify serializer class and to specify permission classes. In our case, just allow any. So this is actually all what we need to do. And now we could register this view with urls file. So let's inside this users app we'll create another file that is called urls.py, and here from Django urls we will import path, and from users.views we'll import create API view. Actually it's called signup, sorry, we call SignupAPIView. And also from REST framework auth token views I would like to import a function that is called obtain auth token. So why we actually use this function? So this function allows us to have this login functionality pretty easily. So we just need to register this view, actually this function, with our urls.py when we have a login API endpoint. So it's pretty easy. So now what we have here, we specify an app name called users, and we specify URL patterns. So we will have several URL patterns. The first thing will be pass API sign up, and we have here SignupAPIView, and we call as view function, and we set a name to SignupAPIView, and then we specify another endpoint that is called login, and here we will use this obtain auth token function, and the name that we'll provide here is called login API view. So the final thing, we need to go to our main package, and here inside settings.py, first thing we need to actually register this user model. So it's a auth user model would be a users, not a user, and we need also to register this users app inside the installed apps property. So and inside main urls.py, what we will have here, we need also to import include function, and now we have here users, and we will include here users.urls, and we specify namespace. In our case it will be users. So configuration process is completed, and we just need to make migrations. So let's go back to the terminal and run command called python. Sorry, we use poetry. So poetry run python manage.py make migrations, and now we called another function, another command that's called migrate. And now we have here our model. So let's go back to the Visual Studio Code, and so what we could do now, we could test our implementation, and the first thing first, as I like always to do, is to write automated test. So let's see how we could do it. So now is ideal moment to write automated tests. But first thing first, we need to actually think about what we need to test. Because if we go here to urls.py file of our users app, you could check that here we have two endpoints, the sign up endpoint and the login endpoint. So because a login endpoint actually functions that is imported from a REST framework auth token package, we don't need actually to test it because it's tested by developers of this functionality, and we need to always test what we actually write ourselves. In our case, we need to validate this SignupAPIView implementation. So we have two situations. The first thing first, we need to check that this actually does work and the user is created properly, so fields are populated, the password is saved correctly, etc. And this next thing, we need to check that actually we could not save two users with the same email address. So the first thing first, let's go and let's create inside this users folder, we will create another folder and we called it tests. And here we will create this init urls.py file that's always used for Python packages, and let's create a test views.py. And a small note here that there is a naming convention that is used by Django tests. So you should prefix all your test files with test word, and they should be placed inside the test package. Also, you could only have two possibilities. Either you could use this test package or you use test.py file. So if you use this tests package, you could not use test.py file, and vice versa. So if you have accidentally test.py file and you have a package, you will get an error. So just a small note here. So the first thing first, from Django.urls we will import reverse functions that we'll use in order to get URLs, and from REST framework.test we will import API test case. And also let's go and get it here. From Django contrib.auth we will import get user model function. So the first thing first, we need to obtain this user model. So we use get user model function here. And now let's create an API test class. So we'll say API users API views tests, and we will extend API test case. And now what we're going to do, we need to create test methods, and you should always remember that there is a naming convention, and test method should start with a test prefix. So we say sign up API view is working, and we have here self argument. So what we need to do, we need to get a URL. So say reverse users sign up API view. So this will be a URL. This will be a URL, and so we will have a body where we have email, just any random data like user.email.com, and we have a password. Let's call it secret1234, and now we will get a response. So say self.client.post, and we have here URL, we have body, and don't forget we need to specify format, which will be JSON. And now we could run a validation. So we say self assert equals, and we get response status code. It should be 201 because this is a status code that's called created. So that means that the data was created successfully. And now what we're going to do is say user objects filter, and we want to find this item in the database. So we need to validate that this was actually created. So we have here email, and it will be body email, and we need to get the first item. So now we need to check that it's not null. So assert not none, and we have here user. And now we need also to check actually that password was successfully saved. We could not make any obvious assertion like assert equals because the password is actually hashed. And what we could do instead, we could use self assert true, and we could use this check password functions, which is a built-in for user models. And here we specify a raw value. So we have body password. So this is a test for SignupAPIView. And the next test case is to check that we could not save two users with the same email. So we say SignupAPIView no double emails. And the first thing, we need to create a pre-existing user in our database. So we'll say user objects create a user. We specify here email. Let's call it user.email.com, and we specify here a password. Now, what we're going to do, we will copy this lines of code, but instead of verifying the status code 201, we will verify 400. So now we will be notified by this status code that we could not save this user because this user does already exist. So now what we're going to do, we will run this automated test. So let's go to the terminal and call poetry run python manage.py test command. as you see that our two tests that we have here were successfully run. So now, as we have these automated tests completed properly, we could do manual testing. So we could run our application and we could use your favorite API client in order to check that everything is working correctly. Okay, so now we could finish this tutorial by doing some manual testing. So let's go to the terminal, which is opened obviously on my screen, and let's run command poetry run python manage.py run server, which is a command that is used to run the development server. So let's run this command, and you could see that we have this development server on the localhost 8000 port. So let me go to my favorite API client, which is called Insomnia, and let's execute some manual tests just to verify that everything is working properly. So let me just organize things, and let's create a new folder that I called users, because we have here users app, and create a new request called localhost 8000 users API sign up, and don't forget about the final slash here because we have it in Django, and we make it the post request, and here we specify a body which will be a JSON body, and here we have email, let's say my email here, email.com, and we have here a password. Let's make it pretty simple. And now let's execute this request. So let's send this request, and now as you could see we have this user model. But when we want to execute this this request with this email value second time, we should have an error, and this will be a 400 byte request status code, because a user with this email does already exist in our database. So now let me rename this to sign up, and let me go back to Visual Studio Code, and let me open this SQLite file, DB SQLite, and if we go here to users table, you will check that here we have this email saved properly, we have here ID, and also that password is actually hashed. So we will not have here a plain password that we have specified as a part of request. So now let me go to Insomnia, and let's create another request, and it will called login. So let's move it here, let's call it a login. And here we also have a post request to the localhost 8000 users API login. And in this case, we will use this obtain auth token function. So here we have requests that first have a username. So in this request, we specify not email but a username. So our username field is called username, but here we remember that our username field is actually an email. So we have here email that we have here. So we will copy this value, and let's go to login. And the password, remember the password that we have here is 1234 secret. So here we have a password, and let's specify this password. So let me call this endpoint. As you see, we have this authentication token, but once we have like another password which is not valid, this function will have also a bad request response, because we could not log in with provided credentials, because the password is not what we have in the database. So this is how we could implement this functionality, how we could use email addresses instead of usernames with Django and Django REST framework. So if you found this video useful for you, don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Don't forget to like this video and share with your colleagues and friends. So I will wait you in next videos.